Hey there, welcome back to another episode of Mixcraft Quick Tips, the series where we take a look at helpful tips in Mixcraft to improve your workflow and your productions. For more quick tips, be sure to subscribe to the channel down below, and if you have a suggestion for a future episode, let us know down in the comments. In today's video, I wanted to share with you a really easy trick to help you get cleaner and more professional sounding mixdowns. The range of human hearing goes from about 20 Hz up to about 20 kHz. Now, if we think about listening to an element of a mix in isolation, like let's say the drums or an acoustic guitar or something, if we play it by itself, it probably sounds fine because it's free to occupy that entire spectrum. However, in the context of a mix, when we have a lot of elements going together, there's a finite amount of space we can occupy, and we really have to emphasize only the important parts in order to get everything to sound good together. Otherwise, if everything is just allowed to be as it is without any kind of interference or balancing in the mixing process, you end up with this big frequency soup that's just muddy and hard to understand. This is a really easy process that can be done in only a couple of clicks in only a few minutes, and will save you a lot of headaches in the mixing stage later down the line. And between you and me, sometimes I forget to do this myself, and then I end up kind of kicking myself in the head later on. So let's fire up our EQs, hop into Mixcraft, and get started. One of the funny things about mixing is that often the elements of a mix are made up of a lot of unnecessary frequencies that we don't need in order for them to translate and be intelligible. Here I've cooked up a little example session using only a handful of elements, and let's take a listen to the mix before and after this process is applied. The only difference between the before and after is that I'm going to enable the low pass and high pass filters with the EQs. As you can probably tell, in the filtered version, everything sounds a lot more defined because we've carved out all of the unnecessary parts of each element. We end up opening up those frequencies for the elements that need to occupy those areas. The question remains though, how do you do this and how do we make these decisions? As an example here, let's solo out the ARP layer. Let's disable this first EQ and we'll add a new EQ here. So we'll go in and search for a TB parametric equalizer. Now we'll go up to the spectrum analyzer area here and change the mode to left plus right sum. So behind the EQ, we're going to see a frequency spectrum, which represents the frequencies that this sound is made out of. Now, to some of you, this might seem obvious, but I think it is worth covering very quickly. On this frequency spectrum here, we have the low end up to the high end. The low end here is your low end elements, things like your kick drum and your bass. This middle section is known as the mid-range, which would be things like your vocals, maybe synth leads, the body of a snare, the kind of earthy, warm section of an acoustic guitar, and other things like that. Then finally, in the high end here, we have things like the air of a vocal performance or the sizzle of the cymbals and other very bright elements. As an example, let's take a listen to this ARP section without any EQ being applied just to hear the sound as it is, and we'll look at the frequency spectrum here behind the EQ. Let's slow this down here and take a quick look. We can see we've got actually quite a bit of low-end information in this sound, which is audible, but it's not really bad because we're listening to this sound in isolation. Now, while this isn't a lot of low-end, it's not like a big booming sub-bass or something like that, the problem with this is this will really add up over the course of a mix, especially once we've got maybe 10 or 20 tracks going. All of this low-end ends up combining together to create a lot of unnecessary low-end, and that ends up using that low information, which we should be saving for things like the kick and the bass. It just becomes this big bassy mess because there's all these bassy frequencies happening. Luckily though, this process is really simple. Let's go to band 1 here and we'll change the filter type to a low cut. Now, in order to figure out where we need to cut, we'll go up to the track here and we're going to set this all the way down to the bottom. We'll give this a play and we'll start moving it up until the sound sounds a bit too thin, and then we'll start backing it off a bit. Right there, it's a bit telephony. Let's roll it off. Right about there seems good. Let's take another listen. Let's turn off the EQ and bring it back in. Even though it's a subtle difference, you can hear we've really cleared up a lot of low-end information from this sound, and it actually seems to jump out a bit more because the energy of this track isn't being used up by unnecessary frequencies. Let's take a look at another example here, like this first lead sound. If we take a look at this, I've done the same process. I cleared out that low end, and then I did the same for the high end information here. Let's solo this out and take a listen without the EQ. And bring it in. Now you'll hear it actually sounds more or less the same. We've just thinned it out and got rid of the unnecessary stuff. Shaving off the high end follows this same process, so I changed band 6 to a high cut filter, and then I just open this all the way up, and then we'll roll it down until it sounds too dull or maybe too muddy. And then we'll open it back up. This way, we've saved these really high and bright frequencies for things like the hi-hats and the cymbals and the overall air of the track. One final example that might be kind of interesting is this bass line here. I've got this kind of arpeggiated running bass line. And you'll see I've actually taken low end out of the bass, which might seem a bit confusing and counterintuitive. These low end frequencies down here are very low and very powerful, and they end up eating up a lot of space and a lot of headroom in our mix, which can kind of feel like it's squashing everything because it's just so overwhelmingly low. Once we start talking about these frequencies down here below about 50 hertz or so, these are actually sounds that we feel more than we actually hear because they're so low, but they require a lot of energy to reproduce and a lot of energy to stop them. By eliminating the subby low-end information here, we end up balancing this bass more towards the bassy region rather than the sub-bass region. And if we take a look at this EQ here and disable this band by just right-clicking on it, you'll see that we have a pretty overwhelming amount of sub-bass information, but if we enable it again, we get rid of a lot of that super low subby information, but it frees things up and the bass still sounds nice and deep. It just maybe sounds a bit more energetic than it does kind of subby and flubby. One thing worth noting is that you might not need to high pass and low pass every single track in your mix. In some cases, you might need to shave off just a tiny bit of high end. In some cases, it might be a very subtle low end adjustment, or in some cases, you might not need to do much of anything at all. It's important to simply use your ears and always double check your changes, especially in the context of the mix, because that's where it counts. And I think that wraps everything up for our time here today. Be sure to subscribe down below for more quick tips like this one, and as always, thanks for watching.